Welcome back to another episode of the Root and Rise podcast. I am your host, Breanne, and I am here with a special guest to talk about all things difficult conversations, how to start them, how to end them, and everything in between. This is part 2 of my interview with Amy Green Smith. If you haven't listened to the first part, we spoke about overcoming imposter syndrome and people pleasing. We are going to drop back in right where we left off in the conversation as we transition from imposter syndrome and people pleasing to speaking up and having difficult conversations. I thought that this would be a perfect one to release right around the holidays. I hope that you are fortunate enough to spend the holidays with people who truly love and support you and bring peace into your life. But that's not the case for a lot of people. I know the holidays can be stressful and bring up a lot of uncomfortable and difficult conversations. And even if it's not the holidays you're worried about, but some other difficult conversation, this episode is for you. She shares crafting responses when caught off guard, setting clear boundaries in communication, handling polarizing political discussions with family, strategies for speaking up without getting entangled in those larger debates, and so much more. Make sure you're subscribed to the Root and Rise podcast because the final part of our interview will be coming soon. We talk about how to powerfully say no and set strong boundaries, along with some tips for your self-worth and managing that mean inner critic. Without further delay, let's warmly welcome the masterful speaker and empowerment advocate, Amy Green Smith, to the Root and Rise podcast. Fair warning, though, there might be a bit of colorful language, so if you have little ones nearby, it's earbud time for this episode. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.
The important piece about this is understanding that people pleasing is pretty much directly antithetical to speaking up for yourself. So we can tap into, where am I chronically silencing myself? Where am I pissed about something, but I haven't given voice to it to the appropriate party? What I'm not talking about here is just venting and just needing to clear it and to just like, oh, I had this hard day, let me just get this out. I'm not talking about those situations. I'm talking about habitual ways of complaining about something that other person may have no idea that you're upset about.
Mm-hmm.
So asking yourself, would this other person have any idea how impacted I am by that exchange, that experience, that work request? If no, then that's your ability. That's your responsibility to go and say, hey, here's what's happening for me. And then that's where we get tough conversations and boundaries, et cetera. But usually if we start with, what and whom do I complain about the most chronically without taking action? That's usually where I need to start with analyzing my people-pleasing behavior. Because if it's worth complaining about, it's probably worth taking action on.
And you're already spending energy on it, so why not direct that energy towards a solution?
That's right. That's right. 100%.
Oh, love that. So, talking about having uncomfortable conversations, once we figure out what's happening with us and what we need to say, how do we begin to have those conversations? And what do you say when you don't know what to say?
Ooh, okay. So let me start with what you don't know what to say, because that one's easier.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like it'd be the harder one. That's so funny.
Yeah, it's not. It's actually significantly easier. It feels paralyzing because you're like, what tool do I draw upon? Like, I don't know what to say. So the best thing that you can say is calling out that you don't know what to say. So to say something like, to be honest, I'm really caught off guard by that. Or I'm going to need to gather my thoughts a little bit more before I respond to that. Or I'm noticing some stuff coming up for me. I don't think it's appropriate for me to respond right now. So essentially, if you don't know what to say and you're caught off guard you've got to buy yourself some time.
And you have permission for that. Like, how relieving. I feel like I personally feel in those moments like I need to jump and take action or handle this or fix it. And I love that you're just giving permission to, like, no, you don't need to do anything right now. It's okay.
Well, another sort of offshoot of this is people asking you questions that you either don't know the answer to or don't want to engage in the conversation about. So my partner and I have been together 26 years, and we've always been very much child-free by choice. Not necessarily that I'm like, everyone should be child-free. I just feel like everyone's fulfilled in a different way. And like, let's just honor that.
Yeah.
And
what's right for you is what's right for you.
Yeah. But in the earlier years, we've been together since the 90s. So in the earlier years, it was constantly, when are you having babies? When are you having babies? And I'm like, oh, I don't really like them very much,
Yeah.
which was an unacceptable thing to say, right? But
Which
I'm
is
like,
so silly. I accept
it
that.
is. It's so silly. But just because you're asked a question doesn't mean you need to answer. So if somebody were to say to me, when are you having kids? Or why don't you want them? Which is so rude, but very common. Why don't you want kids? To go, actually, that's not something I'm interested in discussing right now.
Mm,
So that's a perfect example of, I'm not going to entertain the conversation. And we do that sometimes with being caught off guard,
mhm,
or when we don't know what to say to the situation. Just shut down that conversation. And that's going to have nuance, right? So if somebody randomly that I don't know, that I'm at grocery shopping and they want to say something to me about not having kids, that will be a situation I shut down immediately. Like,
mhm,
that's not something that I'm interested in discussing, because I don't have an investment in that relationship. However, if it was, somebody in my family or something like that, depending on the nature of the relationship, I might say, you know what, I've been having a difficult time with that lately, and it's not something that I would like to discuss. I truly hope you can understand. If if a boss comes to you and wants an answer, and they're it's rapid pace and they're bringing this urgency, it can be so easy to mimic that same urgency. We have what's called emotional contagion. We'll catch the emotional energy of other people. So if someone shows up like urgent, 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 you feel like, I've got to have an answer. I got to know what to say. But in those situations, and this takes a lot of skill and practice, but to go like, okay, I'm feeling that this is really, really intense. Again, emotional intelligence. I'm getting that this is really, really urgent for you. I need at least a minute to just wrap my head around what you just said. Right? Or, you know what? Give me 1 second. I'm going to run to the bathroom. That's a great one. Just
mm,
fucking leave. I'm going to run to the bathroom and I'll be right back. And then when you're in the bathroom, that's when you formulate your next step. Right? Because again, no one has taught us this stuff. No
mhm,
one has given us these little hacks of what I can say to end a conversation. Um, I've had situations with polarizing political topics that have come up
mhm,
with family members where they want to keep drilling down. And the important thing for everyone to hear, I think, also is that you can speak up for yourself and not get involved in a huge conversation. So what that might sound like is, let's say, okay, I'll give you personal experience. My brother was going off about guns. We have totally different perspective about guns. I don't want to get into the conversation right then, but I sure as fuck am not going to let my silence make me a liar. So I'm not going to sit there and pretend I'm okay with it. So what I said is, I don't share those opinions. I would love it if we could change topics, but I needed to be clear that I don't share that opinion. And then he wants to talk, 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 talk. And that's when you reiterate, you know what? I don't share that opinion, like I mentioned, but I'm not interested in talking about it right now. Or I don't think this is the place, or I don't think this is the best time. I hope you can understand. And you have to reinforce that boundary over and over again if they want to keep baiting you.
mhm,
Or if they say like, oh, you're just being so sensitive, or you're so emotional, and they want to cast blame or offload their embarrassment of being called out. So in those situations, you say, I really don't appreciate you discounting my emotions, and I'm going to politely excuse myself from this conversation, and you remove. So there's a handful on when you don't know what to say. With your first question of like, how do we even broach a difficult conversation? There are so many different elements, but I want to give you just sort of a peppering that might be helpful. First and foremost, get conversation consent. This is asking for the time to talk, asking for the conversation. Because just like we were talking about with getting caught off guard and how disorienting that is, and if someone is just like, hey, can you babysit my kids this coming weekend? And I really need, and they're coming at you wrapped in that package of urgency, it's so easy to get sucked into like, oh, I've got to make a decision right now and I've got to do it. But if we're able to actually prep for the conversation, if we don't want to be caught off guard, other people sure as fuck don't want to be caught off guard. So let's set it up for success. The other thing is, just because you're empowered and ready to have a great conversation about this difficult topic doesn't mean the other person is. They might have just got their ass handed to them by their boss, or maybe they just dealt with their kid throwing up all over the living room. Like, You have to set yourself up for success by gauging if the conversation container is healthy in that moment. So, a couple of things here. Do not say we need to talk. Okay. That is clear for all women. I think
Yes.
like it is the shittiest thing to say we need to talk. Like it just has such a negative connotation. A couple of options to say instead would be things like, hey, I've got a couple of things that have been on my mind I'd love to toss around with you. Or I'd love to get your thoughts on something that I've been kind of ruminating on. Do you have some time on Tuesday? Right? Or do you have time after the kids go to bed tonight? I want to be respectful of what you've got going on in your day. Again, because we have emotional contagion and we have mirror neurons in the brain, so we will naturally mimic other people. It's actually a survival technique. So if you come across with vulnerability, as much as you can, not all relationships warrant vulnerability, but if you can come through softly in some way, you're more likely to elicit that softness in return. If you think about driving and you accidentally cut somebody off and they're like, fuck you, screaming and like flipping you off and stuff, your response to their anger, you don't go, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to really look at that deeply and think about what I can do differently next time.
Yeah.
We go, when we deal with that sort of aggression, we go into our fight, flight, freeze, fawn. So we either go like, hey, we get mad in return, or we kind of cower and we go, oh God, oh my God, I'm so sorry, so sorry. So we have to recognize that the energy that we bring into a conversation is likely to be mirrored. Is that a good thing or not? So starting with just the request of, I value your time, not the demand of we need to talk. And something a bit more soft and innocuous, like, I've been thinking about some things, I'd love to get your perspective. Now, if they ask what about, tell them what it's about. You can certainly say we can dig into this later, but yeah, it's about the stuff that came up around sort of the division of labor in the house the other night. I would just love a do-over. I've been thinking about some things, whatever, right? But think about how you feel when someone says like, I need a meeting with you, and they don't tell you what it's about, and how we go into our defenses.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we're asking for the time to talk. Now, when you actually go into the conversation, lead with as much vulnerability as you can. Now, vulnerability can be incredibly terrifying for certain individuals, depending on the nature of the dynamic in the relationship. Also, I have to mention here that this does not apply to abusive relationships. Okay. We're talking about, for the most part, healthy, of course, flawed human conversations. I'm not talking about malignant narcissism. I'm not talking about verbal abuse, name calling. I'm not talking about those sorts of things, because the last thing we need is more people, again, disproportionately women, thinking, I just need to do something different and then they'll hear me.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case for abuse. Okay. So if you're in a situation, I'm sure you've talked about this many times, where the other party never takes ownership, zero. It's always, well, I would do that if you would do this instead, right? There's zero onus of responsibility. Then okay, this is probably more of an abusive trauma situation. This is not calling for regular communication tactics.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my little blurb message about that one. So we're asking for the time to talk. We're going to lead with vulnerability. So what that can sound like is very simply, there have been some things that have been on my mind, and I realized that you would probably have zero idea that this was going on for me. And that was really wildly unfair to you. And I realized if the tables were turned, I would want you to come to me. So I'd love for you to just listen as I share kind of what I've been making up on my end. And then I would love to get your feedback, right? So we're starting on, that's a vulnerable statement, right? That we're not going in going, you do this, and then you make me feel and blah, blah. We're going in saying like, hey, listen, there's been a reality I'm experiencing over here that you might have zero ideas about.
Mm-hmm.
And so we at least need to give people the opportunity to be what we need, right? Like, have we given them the opportunity? And if you've screamed and yelled, if you've been passive aggressive, those don't count as communicating your needs, right?
Mm-hmm. You're answering questions as they're popping up in my brain. You're like, and this is leading with vulnerability. And I'm like, oh, how do you do that? And you're like, and this is how you do that. I'm like, wow, you are either a mind reader or you're very good at this.
Yeah. Well, I think the latter.
Yeah. I love it though. No, I think that's perfect. And so, how do you handle not having that support from people that you think you should, or maybe that you expected it from?
Oh, yeah. This again comes back to emotional intelligence because so frequently when we experience a distressing emotion or something that feels uncomfortable, like ridicule, or I feel dismissed or unimportant, that's when we usually start making up conclusions about, okay, I need to change myself in this way so that they like me, or I need to be so flawless and perfect that I'm accepted. So we get really caught in that significantly. The other thing that I think is really important to understand here is that, again, we're wired for belonging. There is a very real reason why many of us end up in therapy talking about parental wounds, because we are so wired and attached to our families. That's where we're supposed to receive security and safety, affirmations and acknowledgments about who we are. That's not the case for many of us. The first piece that we have to recognize is sometimes the people who we wish were our biggest allies are not capable of being those allies. And I oftentimes will say, speak your truth into ears that can hear you. Not all ears are capable of hearing you. And when I use this statement, I'm talking specifically about you sharing things that matter to you and needing a safe place for those things to land. If you're making a really risky jump in your career and you want nothing more than your mom to support you, but you know she's got a lot of limiting beliefs around, quote, real jobs or what stability looks like, that if you were to share your enthusiasm in a way that you're already a little bit precious about, you're feeling a little fragile about this big decision, going to someone who's going to reinforce disempowering beliefs is not going to be helpful. So it's really about deciphering whose ears are safe for me to speak my truth into. And there's a bit of a grief process with that, I think, is recognizing that the people we wish were the ones coming through for us are not always the ones who do. I had a situation like that many years ago. I did like a public coming out post on Facebook, and I got so much support and so much just unbelievable amount of love shown my way, but nobody in my family commented. And my brother, whom I'm extremely close with, didn't comment. That was by far the most hurtful piece of that exchange. I have a lot of comfort in knowing who I am and all of that stuff. But I think sometimes we have to recognize that when you start growing, when you start loving who you are, when you start believing that your voice matters, sometimes there are casualties. Sometimes the collateral damage are the people in your life who would prefer the people-pleasing version of you. They don't love the empowered version of you. And sometimes that's malicious. And then sometimes that's just because we're creatures of habit. Most of the time, it's the latter. So I think there's recognizing that sometimes when I speak up for myself, I'm going to have dichotomous emotion. I'm going to have the feeling of pride in myself. And then I'm also going to have the feeling of disappointment if that other person doesn't like what I have to say, or doesn't think that I'm making the right choice, or is outright mean to me. Those things can coexist. And I think that's where we have to get really clear about what will be success. My new definition of success is if I speak up for myself, articulate where I'm coming from, and I do it from a place of grace and kindness, but I don't waffle. I don't take back my opinions, my stances. I can apologize for my delivery if I was too harsh or something like that, but I'm not going to apologize for a perspective just because somebody else doesn't share the same one. So again, a lot of it comes back to that emotional intelligence and acuity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that
Yeah.
just makes me think about you're talking about using your voice and being able to say things the wrong way. I mean, I felt a breath of relief with that. I feel like it's better to say the wrong thing than to say nothing. And especially in times where you are feeling very passionate and triggered and emotional, like you said, that's a little flag for you that's like, hey, bitch,
Yeah.
pay attention to me.
Yes.
So I love that you talk about saying the wrong thing and that it's okay to go back and say, hey, yeah, maybe I said that a little harsh, or maybe I could have said that a little differently. But just knowing that it's okay to say the wrong thing. When I first started finding my voice, I feel like it came out a little harsh and direct. Having been a survivor of abuse, felt like I had to really sugarcoat a lot of things I said and had to like pad a lot of my points and feelings and opinions. It's taken a long time to like really break all of that padding off. But now like my delivery is a little harsh because it's very just straight and to the point. And so I love just giving the permission of like, it's okay. You get your point across. And, you know, if your intention isn't to harm and you're not being hurtful, it's okay to backpedal and say, hey, yeah, I was a little harsh. I just really like that. Thank you for bringing up that point.
Well, it comes from learning my own lessons really the hard way. And the trajectory for me was I had got my father passed in '07, and there's a whole long story with that I'll save for another time. But it eventually put a real significant strain on the relationship with my mom and myself. And we feel very, very differently about every all the matters of the heart, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And all your convictions, all of your deep-seated beliefs, we could not be more opposite. So we're kind of relegated to talking about like HGTV and like gardening because in order for the relationship to survive such polarized belief systems, and both of us have kind of decided, me very consciously, her, I'm not so sure, that it's more important for that person to be in my life than it is for me to be right.
Mm.
And so that then informs some boundaries about the nature of the relationship. But with her in particular, I lost my shit so many times. Once I sort of let my guard down or decided that I was going to start speaking up for myself, it was like I overcorrected and I became incredibly adversarial, super combative.
Mm.
I wanted to fight about all of the things we felt differently about. And it wasn't until many, many times that I had to go back and clean up my delivery that I realized, oh shit, you can actually speak up for yourself about really polarizing topics and do that with grace and kindness. You can ask an adult child to move out of the house. You can ask for a divorce. You can tell your family you don't believe in the religion you were raised in. You can do all of those things with the utmost grace, kindness, poise, compassion. But we're not really taught that. We're kind of set, it's like, oh, if I speak up, I'm a bitch, or I'm causing harm, I'm purposely hurting people. And we have to recognize that when we go back to try to remedy the relationship, we sometimes get like a speaking up hangover where we're like, oh my gosh, I want to take it back. I'm going to take back everything I said instead of just taking back the delivery. And what that sounds like is, hey, mom, I still feel very strongly about the things we discussed yesterday, but I should not have spoken to you in that way. You don't deserve to be spoken to in that manner. And for that, I'm incredibly sorry. So being very clear about what you are cleaning up, you're not apologizing for your viewpoints, your stances, your opinions, your desires. We're apologizing for how we communicated that. And that's really key, because if you are in a heightened emotional place, you just found out that your partner didn't pay a bill they said they were going to pay, or they left their shoes out after you just had a conversation about where you're putting the shoes. Those moments of explosive anger feel like, intuitively, it feels like I need to fight, right? We're in fight, flight, freeze, where I've been threatened. I need to scream and yell about it. So sometimes practicing emotional regulation is completely counterintuitive. So we have to stop ourselves in the middle of those explosions and going, okay, my anger is warranted. Let me go process that. Let me beat the shit out of my bed, or scribble furiously, or, go to a rage room, or buy a damn it doll, or whatever. Like, I'm going to process the emotion, and then I can set myself up for much better success in a conversation. Because you go in again, guns blazing. It's like that person you accidentally cut off while you're driving, and they're just screaming and yelling. You'd never, very seldomly, I will say, will you get the result you are looking for. Because most of the time, this is what we have to remember when we're going into a difficult conversation or establishing a boundary. We typically just want to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
We want to be heard, and then we want some sort of change. That doesn't happen if you're coming at that person like a bat out of hell.
Mm-hmm.
So again, we have to have this sort of emotional understanding and regulation.
And be aware of the impact and how it's going to land.
Exactly. And that's also going to be different depending on the person, the
Mm-hmm.
family environment. I had a client years ago that her dad did not respond well to anything overly emotional, could not stand long phrases. Like he just went like bottom line me, give me
Mm-hmm.
short snippets. So the stuff that we had worked on didn't work for that relationship. So we had to pivot that. And so her verbiage to him was much more like, listen, I understand that you're upset. You cannot speak to me in that way. I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to go in the other room. So it wasn't lengthy.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like, hey, listen, I want to just tell you a couple of things that have been going on for me. That didn't work with him. So
Mm-hmm.
it's allowing nuance to exist inside these different relationships too.
Oh, I love that. There are so many different perspectives and life experiences and realities coming into play.
100%. Yes, definitely.
This is still only a portion of my enlightening conversation with Amy. Tune in next week to hear about how to powerfully say no and set strong boundaries. In that episode, she also gives some tips for increasing your self-worth and managing that mean inner critic. Make sure you are subscribed to the Root and Rise podcast so you don't miss a thing. But before we part ways, Amy, can you quickly share with our listeners where they can connect with you?
You can find me really anywhere on social under the handle, Hey, Amy Green Smith.
Perfect. I will have that linked in the show notes. And thank you so much for being here with us, Amy. I have learned so much. I know my listeners have. This is going to be broken up into multiple parts, and I already want you back. So
Oh,
thank you
yay. I love
very
it.
much for your time, your energy, and all of your wisdom.
Well, thank you so much. And you are most welcome.
Thank you so much for tuning in today. It has been a pleasure hanging out with you, and I'm looking forward to next time.